Hi, so I decided to do my learning center on storytelling. This learning center would be used primarily in a third grade classroom. However, all the activities within the center can definitely be modified for higher or lower grade levels. The standards that I have chosen to have for this center is the North Dakota Reading Standard. It's RL.2, recount stories, including fables, folktales, and myths from diverse cultures to determine the essential message, lesson, or moral and explain how it conveys through key details in the text. And then another standard was with prompting and support, identifying characters, settings, and major events in a story. I also included a social studies standard that cross-cuts with the other standards for one of my activities. That standard is students are able to construct maps, graphs, and other representations that contain symbols, labels, and legends. If I was able to have a trifold poster with me, I would have a section on the poster for students to view the definition of storytelling, as well as have a section with information for students to refer back to if they need a refresher. These in this section, I would have a list of elements of a story, as well as a description of story retelling, because majority of my activities require this knowledge. So many of my standards include writing components and writing opportunities. My first activity that has a writing component is the creative writing activity. In this activity, students will create their own unique stories using story cards that will be available to them. Their story will need to consist of 3 different things: an object, a theme, and a character. They will pick one card from each of those categories, and that will determine what their story must be about. When students turn in their writing, I'm able to assess students' phonics, vocabulary, and comprehension development. This type of activity could be something that is done on a daily basis. Creative writing also allows students to expand their creativity and imagination while also practicing the big 5 components through writing. Another thing with this activity, I'll be able to determine what students understand the elements of a story, and if they were able to construct their story correctly. And you can also pause this and you can read my directions at the bottom for each activity I do. My next activity, I only have a reading component in it, and it is retelling of a story with a flannel board. In this activity, students will read the book if you gave them also a cookie, which is also one of the 3 trade books available for students in the classroom. After students read the book, they will use the flannel board and felt pieces that are provided at the center to retell the story. In order for me to assess their learning, I will then have them use their iPads to record themselves retelling the story with the felt pieces. With this activity, students are able to practice all of the big 5 components through reading. I will be able to assess them based on if they are able to retell the story correctly or not. The biggest thing I think this activity will do is show me how well they are able to comprehend a story and retell it afterwards. This activity extends beyond the classroom because they are constantly reading books and having to retain information from them and be able to share that information with others. This allows students to practice this skill because it is something that they will have to do many times in the classroom outside of this center. Students need to be able to comprehend different types of text and readings. And another thing, since students are using their iPads to record themselves, this activity has a technology component. From this, I will be able to determine if students are able to record and submit something successfully on Seesaw. It is important that students become more comfortable using technology for things like recording themselves or submitting assignments, because it is something that they will end up doing. It will come up many times throughout school. Another activity that has a reading component is the sequencing a story activity. In this activity, students are able to show their learning in regards to sequencing a story. Oops, I was on the wrong one. Sorry. Students will start this activity by reading 2 books. They will first read The 3 Little Pigs. At this activity, there will be a worksheet that has sequencing cards on it for students to color and cut out. Once they cut it out, they're able to glue the cards in the order that the events happened in. They will then repeat the steps with the book, Goldilocks and the 3 Bears. which is also one of the trade books that I have available to them during the center. From this activity, I'll be able to assess students' understanding of sequencing. It will allow me to determine if students are comprehending the different stories and if they are able to put events in the order that they occur. This concept extends from the activity because students are applying all of the Big Five components in some way, just like they will with any other class activity or lesson. This is also important because students need to be able to sequence a story and events. This is something that will be used many times in the classroom, and understanding that there is a beginning, middle, and end to a story and being able to determine what events occur when. Another activity in the center that includes a technology component is what you saw before that I was on, and that is the comparing and contrasting a story using Venn diagram activity. So with this activity, students are going to use their iPads to read two different versions of the same book. They can pick books from the book list that I provided to them at their center, and they will have to go on either Epic or Tumble books, preferably Tumble books because they'll be more familiar with that, and either read or listen to the two books. This part of the activity is the technology component as well as the reading component. Then they will have to compare and contrast the two books, which is the writing component. This activity has students really think about the elements of storytelling because they are having to really dissect and investigate both books. I believe that this activity primarily assesses students' comprehension and phonics because students are having to be able to read the books as well as understand what they are reading, and followed by having to prove their understanding by completing the Venn diagram. Once students turn in their worksheet, I will be able to determine if they are able to pick out the key details and differentiate between the two stories. Practicing these components expands from this activity because being able to compare and contrast different things is very important. And with so many books having different versions, it's important that students are able to differentiate between books. Not only that, but this activity helps students further their comprehension development that will help them with other class activities and lessons. The last activity that is in the Storytelling Center that is primarily a reading component and a small writing component is creating a story map activity. This activity also cross-cuts with the North Dakota Social Studies standard on knowing how to construct maps, graphs, and other representations that contain symbols, labels, and legends. Students will start this activity by reading the trade book, The Little Red Riding Hood, that is available to them in the center. After reading the book, students will be able to construct their own maps that explains Little Red Riding Hood's journey to Grandma's house. Before making their maps, students are to brainstorm different things that they would put on their map to explain the story. I will have prompting questions in the directions available to them, as you can also see on the PowerPoint, to help them guide their thinking. This activity allows students to be creative and have fun while creating their interpretations of the book through drawings and symbols. Students will incorporate the writing component by labeling their drawings and making a key for their symbols. This activity will also allow me to assess students' learning and understanding on retelling of a story, and if they can construct a map correctly and with the right components. Doing this activity requires students to use all of the Big Five components in different ways. They're having to read a book, comprehend it, and show their understanding. This reading and writing component relates to the storytelling and extends beyond the activity because both constructing and understanding maps and retelling a story are both something that students need to know how to do in order to read maps and understand a story. So within my center, there are 3 manipulatives that I will have available for students to work with during their activities. The first manipulative is the flannel board and felt pieces for retelling of a story activity. This manipulative can be used for students to not only retell the story that they just read, but they can also make their own stories using this manipulative. Another manipulative that I have is the creative writing cards. This manipulative can be used in many different ways. You could have students use 3 cards or just 1 card. They could use these cards to act out a story rather than write one. Many different things can be done, and I love that these I love these cards because it can be so hard for students to write creatively without a prompt sometimes, and these cards I feel like push them to use their imagination and creativity. The last manipulative that I have in my center is the sequencing cards for the sequencing a story activity. This manipulative is nice because students are able to practice their sequencing skills using pictures rather than reading the book and then having to just know off the top of their head. And they're also able to use sequencing cards for multiple different stories. You can also use sequencing for many different subjects. So having an activity like this allows them to practice that skill. I will also have all the materials needed for each activity available to the students at the center. This is a list of all of the materials. For my creative writing activity, I would have the worksheet and a pencil and the creative writing cards. For the sequencing and story activity, I will have the worksheet with the sequencing cards on them, a pencil, scissors, glue, colored pencils, the book, The Three Little Pigs, and the book, Goldilocks and the Three Bears. For the creating a story map activity, I will have the book, The Little Red Riding Hood. I will have crayons, markers, colored pencils, a pencil, and white construction paper available to the students. For the retelling a story with a flannel board activity, the students will have access to the book. If you gave them also a cookie, they'll have a flannel board, felt pieces, and their iPad. For the last activity, comparing and contrasting a story, students will need to have access to both versions of the book they choose, the Venn diagram worksheet, and a pencil. Students will be provided these materials, so there is no reason that they aren't able to complete all the activities within the center. Next, I will have 3 trade books available for students to use during activities, which all of the books are required for at least one of the activities. I have the book Red Riding Hood that is used in the story map activity. The Goldilocks and the Three Bears book is used in the sequencing story. And the book If You Gave a Mouse a Cookie is used for the flannel board activity. Along with these books, I have a list of 10 other trade books that would be helpful in storytelling. And also students are able to use those books in some of the activities as well. At the center, I will also have a check-off list for the students to keep track of which activities they do and to also help me determine which activities students still need to complete. I made the checklist for students to put a green X in the box of the activity they have completed, and if they're unable to finish an activity, they will put a red X in the activity box. To finish, I'll have a choice board at the center for students who complete all the activities early. There are 6 choice board activities. Students have the option to do a comic strip activity, stick puppet activity, use the Chatterpix app, read a book from the book list that they have not read yet, create an elements of a story roadmap, or write a narrative. Each one of these activities on the choice board will help students expand their learning and knowledge in regards to storytelling, as well as help them practice what they have learned already. So with that being said, after the students complete all the storytelling activities, they should be able to recount stories and determine the central message, lesson, or moral of the story, and be able to explain how it is conveyed through key details in the text, along with identifying characters, settings, and major events in a story. And along with that too, they are also able to construct a map, graph, or other representations that contain symbols, labels, and legends. And that concludes my Learning Center.